Do you know what the biggest nightmare is for PR teams and marketers at multinational corporations? It's not a stock crash and not even getting exposed for tax evasion. What they fear the most is that you, ordinary people, might suddenly find out how they actually started. They want us to think they've always been like this: sterile, high tech, eco friendly, smiling from glossy billboards. But the history of business isn't a fairy tale, it's a jungle. And in that jungle, it's not the smartest who survive, but the ones who know how to pivot on the fly. Picture this. You walk into a sleek minimalist store to buy a new smartphone. A sales associate smiles at you and says, "Great choice, but before you check out, would you like to try our signature dried cod? Fresh catch." Or you walk into a luxury car dealership to buy $1 million supercar, and they roll out a rusty but reliable tractor for plowing potato fields. Sounds ridiculous, right? But that's exactly what the real, unpolished history of the brands that run our lives actually looks like. Today, we're doing a deep clean. We're opening the darkest skeleton closets of the world's biggest companies. We'll find out which modern tech giants once sold noodles, which gaming kings serviced gambling machines tied to the Japanese mafia, which luxury car manufacturers made their name with plows, and which soda empires started by selling medicine for every disease. This is a story about how the road to billions almost always begins with something strange, awkward, and sometimes even questionable. Ready? Let's go. Samsung, a dynasty built on cod. Let's start with a Korean giant. Today, Samsung is synonymous with high technology. Phones, TVs, washing machines, microchips, smart refrigerators that can order groceries online. It feels like they make everything. They even have their own shipyards and construction companies building skyscrapers. But if you had met the founder of this empire, Lee Byung-chul, back in 1938 in the city of Daegu, he wouldn't have offered you a pre-order for the latest Galaxy. And he definitely wouldn't have talked about quantum dot displays. Back then, Lee didn't even know the word electronics. He would have looked at you, smiled, and offered you dried fish, or noodles, or some high-quality local rice. Seriously. At that time, South Korea under Japanese occupation was far from being a technological hotspot. It was a poor, agrarian country. People didn't have money for televisions. They just needed something to eat. And Lee Byung-chul understood that. He opened a trading store called Samsung Sangho. The word Samsung translates to 3 stars. Lee wanted his business to be powerful, everlasting, and to shine bright. At that time, the company had only 40 employees, and their core business was buying goods from local farmers and fishermen, drying them so they wouldn't spoil during transport, and exporting them to China and Manchuria. Fish, rice, noodles. Those were the 3 stars of Korea's first startup. Just think about the scale of transformation. The people who today create some of the most advanced microprocessors in the world, with architectures thinner than a human hair, by thousands of times. Once personally checked whether the cod was salted well enough to be shipped to Beijing. They packed bags of rice while their future competitors were already making radios and cars. So, how did they pivot? This is a story of Korean resilience. The Korean War in the early 1950s nearly wiped out everything Lee had built. Warehouses were burned, the business destroyed. But Lee was a master of survival. All he had left was a single truck and a small amount of money. With that, he started over from scratch. After the war, he made a decision. Okay, food is great. People always need it. But a country in ruins needs rebuilding. It needs industry. He opened the largest sugar refinery in the country. Then, in 1954, a textile factory. He wanted to clothe all Koreans in locally made garments. Later, Lee moved into insurance, retail, and publishing. Essentially, he did whatever the market needed at the time. He wasn't tied to a single product, he was tied to profit. And only in the late 1960s, when the Korean economy began to stabilize, Samsung said, "What if we try this trendy thing? What's it called? Electronics." They founded Samsung Electronics. Do you know what their very first product was? A simple, bulky black and white television, the P3202. The irony is that at the time, Koreans didn't yet know how to make them on their own, so they produced them together with their future biggest competitors, Japan's Sanyo. 20 years later, Samsung was teaching the world how to make displays. The lesson from Samsung: if your dried fish business isn't working out, try smartphones or televisions. Maybe you're just in the wrong niche, and your 3 stars haven't lit up yet. Nintendo, cards, Yakuza, and quick loans. Most people think Nintendo is a company that appeared somewhere in the 1970s, together with the first 8-bit consoles and arcade machines about Donkey Kong. But that's a mistake by 100 years. When cowboys were still actively riding across the United States, and Europe had only just invented the automobile, a company called Nintendo was already operating in Japan. But Mario did not exist back then, and neither did any electronics. Fusajiro Yamauchi founded his company Nintendo Kopai back in 1889 in the city of Kyoto, and they produced gambling products. To be more precise, Hanafuda cards. What is Hanafuda? These are not the usual cards we're used to with queens and kings. These are cards with beautiful images of flowers, animals, and seasons. They are very beautiful, but they were mainly used for gambling in underground clubs. And this is where it gets really interesting. Do you know who the main client of Nintendo Kopai was for half a century? The real Japanese mafia, the Yakuza. Gangsters loved these cards. They were handmade. Using expensive materials, the base was made from mulberry tree bark. The Yakuza loved luxury, and they loved Nintendo because the cards were of perfect quality. The criminals knew that no one would be able to mark or rig them if they were made this perfectly. Nintendo literally earned its first money on gambling and crime. The name Nintendo, by the way, is often translated as leave luck to heaven or work hard, but the outcome is in God's hands. A very fitting name for a card business. But by the middle of the 20th century, after World War II, everything changed. Gambling in Japan began to be restricted more strictly, the popularity of Hanafuda fell, and the Yamauchi family, which had run the company for generations, realized that cards would no longer feed them. An era of wild desperation and attempts to survive begins. Now, I'm going to read you a list of startups that Nintendo launched in the 1950s and 60s in order not to go bankrupt. Just appreciate this madness. First, they tried to run their own taxi service. They had clean cars and polite drivers. The business even started going uphill, but the drivers quickly created a union, started striking, and demanding higher wages. Nintendo decided that it was too much trouble and sold the taxi fleet. Failure number 1. Second, they had their own brand of instant rice. Like cup noodles, but rice. But Nintendo at that time did not understand food technology. It tasted like wet cardboard. Nobody bought it. Failure number 2. Third, they produced vacuum cleaners. But these vacuum cleaners were so poorly made that they didn't really suck up dust. Failure number 3. And finally, the most piquant. Nintendo had a network of love hotels. These are hotels where rooms are rented by the hour for romantic meetings. Yes, the exact kind you're thinking of. The same company that today makes the cutest games for the whole family about Pokemon once made money on the fact that people, let's say, were not playing video games. Failure number 4. The business did not bring profit. The company was on the verge of complete collapse. But one day, the president of Nintendo, the grandson of the founder, Hiroshi Yamauchi, the man who will later turn the company into a video game giant, walked into a workshop and saw how one of the regular maintenance engineers, Gunpei Yokoi, in his free time was bored and playing with a homemade toy. It was a simple folding mechanical grabbing hand made from wooden rulers. The president looked at this thing and had an insight. Hanafuda is cool, but the future is in plastic toys for children. He shouted to the engineer, "Yokoi, you're a genius. Urgently bring this thing into production." This toy was called the Ultra Hand. It was cheap, bright, and allowed children to grab things from a distance. It became an absolute hit in Japan. 1.5 million units were sold in a couple of years. Nintendo realized, to hell with hotels, rice, and taxis. We will make toys. They hired Yokoi into the development department, and this guy will later create the Game Boy and the Game & Watch system. And so, the Japanese mafia, rice that tasted like cardboard, hourly hotels, and a random wooden grabbing hand eventually led us to Mario, Zelda, and the Switch. Nokia, indestructible toilet paper and Finnish galoshes. All of us remember the legendary Nokia 3310, a phone legend, a brick, a weapon of mass destruction. You could crack walnuts with it, you could drop it from the 10th floor, put the battery back in, and make a call. There are even memes that the Nokia 3310 does not break. It breaks the asphalt. It was a symbol of reliability. But few people know that 100 years before the appearance of this phone, the company Nokia was engaged in producing things whose main characteristic was, let's say, disposability. In 1865, a Finnish mining engineer named Knut Fredrik Idestam opened a small paper mill on the banks of the Nokianvirta River in the town of Nokia. At that time, Europe was rapidly industrializing. The number of newspapers, books, and bureaucracy was growing, and everyone needed paper. Idestam was a good engineer. He figured out how to make cheap and high-quality paper from wood pulp instead of rags, as had been done before. The business took off, but do you know what their top, most profitable product was in the early 20th century? Toilet paper. I'm not joking. The softest and most reliable toilet paper in Finland proudly carried the Nokia logo. Imagine that. A company whose phone became a symbol of durability once made things that were used once and disposed of in the most radical way. Later, things didn't go so well for the paper makers, and in the 1920s, they merged with a company that produced rubber goods. They figured, we have electricity from our mill, we have territory. Let's make galoshes. Galoshes were extremely in demand in cold and muddy Finland. So, for a good half of the 20th century, the name Nokia in Europe was associated not with high technology, but with reliable rubber galoshes, car tires, and gas masks. Yes, Nokia even produced gas masks for the Finnish army during the war. If you had said the word Nokia to a Finn in 1930, he would have looked at his dirty boots, sighed, and nodded. But how did they get to phones? That only happened in the 1960s and 70s. Nokia became a conglomerate, a huge collection of companies under one brand. They made everything: televisions, cables, plastics, even produced aluminum. And they had a small electronics division. At first, they made professional radios for the military and emergency services. And when in the 1980s the world started to smell like mobile communication, Nokia decided, listen, rubber's boring. Toilet paper's already the past. We have great engineers. Let's make a phone. But it has to be as reliable, indestructible, and simple as our galoshes. The irony is that in the end, Nokia was killed by touchscreens and Android, just like Progress once killed their toilet paper business. The story came full circle. They failed to pivot in time for the second time. Coca-Cola, depression syrup, and secret leaves. Okay, let's move on to the sweetest part. Today, Coca-Cola is not just soda. It's holidays are coming. It's red trucks. It's Santa Claus in a red suit. It's a symbol of happiness, Christmas, and a carefree life. But if you had walked into John Pemberton's pharmacy in Atlanta in 1886, you wouldn't have seen Santa. You would have seen a tired Pemberton trying to brew in his kettle not a soda, but a medicine. And not medicine for a cold, but for very serious problems. Pemberton was a veteran of the U.S. Civil War. He was wounded, and to ease the terrible pain, like many veterans, He became addicted to pharmaceutical morphine and syrups. He developed a severe addiction. Pemberton understood that he was dying, and he wanted to create a syrup that would help him get off morphine. He began experimenting with what was popular and considered useful in medicine at the time. His first recipe contained alcohol, more precisely, French wine, and it also contained coca leaves and cola nuts. The nuts gave energy, and the leaves gave that very cheerful effect. The drink was called Pemberton's French Wine Coca. It was advertised in newspapers as a miraculous tonic. What did it treat? Everything. Headaches, nervous disorders, depression, insomnia, hysteria, and even male impotence. Essentially, it was legal liquid fuel for the brain. People drank it by the bottle to feel more energetic. But then, the city of Atlanta introduced a strict prohibition. Alcohol became banned. This was the collapse of Pemberton's business. Pemberton had to urgently remove the wine from the formula. He didn't want to lose profits. He replaced it with burnt sugar for color, water, and a bunch of flavorings to mask the bitter taste of the cola nuts. As a result, he got a thick, overly sweet syrup that was sold in pharmacies for 5 cents per glass. It had to be diluted with water, at first regular water, and later someone figured out to mix it with carbonated water. By the way, the name was invented by his accountant, Frank Robinson. Pemberton wanted to call the drink something like Pemberton's syrup, but Robinson said, "Listen, 2 C letters in the name will look great in advertising. Let's call it Coca-Cola." And it was also Frank Robinson, the accountant, who drew that very famous Coca-Cola logo in his beautiful calligraphic handwriting, which hasn't changed for over 100 years. One of those cases where the accountant turned out to be cooler than all the marketers. Pemberton never managed to overcome his morphine addiction and died in poverty, selling the rights to the recipe for next to nothing. And his syrup for depression and addiction became the most famous drink on earth. What do all these stories tell us? That no one is born a giant. No one has a ready-made recipe for $1 billion. Big corporations don't appear out of thin air with fully formed genius products. The history of business is a history of constant failures, experiments, and wild pivots. The main thing is not to be afraid to admit that your current idea is so-so. Turn 180 degrees if you feel there's more drive there. The history of corporations is the story of knowing how to pivot on the fly if you want to survive and make money. So, which story surprised you the most? Did you know about toilet paper from Nokia or hotels from Nintendo? Drop a comment and let me know which brand breakdown you're dying to see next. And make sure to subscribe so you don't miss part 2. We'll be covering how Lamborghini challenged Ferrari and the secret behind Toyota's massive success. It only gets more interesting from here.